Senator Green Rain. Okay, I'm just going to... Lost my page now.
We got Senator Baker. He's in the schoolyard now.
No, there's obviously a lot of costs involved in the trafficking of drugs, and there's going to be costs involved in a mandatory minimum sentences. But there are also hopefully going to be a lot less costs in terms of crime in the cities and crime in places, and creating new drug addicts. And so you have to balance both of them. And I think that mandatory minimum sentences is a step in the right direction.
Is that a question?
So, no, that wasn't a question, but thank you very much for coming.
That was very good. Good.
He was making... my question had already been asked by Senator Wallace.
I think it's been quite a long day. Senator Joyal, you were down for a second round.
Yes, very quickly.
We have time for one question from you and one question from Senator Wallace.
My question to Ms. Kane, could you give us the estimated cost that you calculated for the implementation of that bill at the federal level and at the provincial level?
The cost for the Public Prosecution Service of Canada in terms of the prosecution?
No, everything, the prisons, all the costs that this bill will compel the federal government to incur.
No, I'm not at liberty to provide you with all that information that was provided as a cabinet confidence. However, some of it is in the public domain. For example, what I referred to, the cost to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada for prosecution, investigation, and advice to the police for prosecution, because that is noted as part of the funding for the National Anti-Drug Strategy.
So you don't want to inform Canadians or us who are parliamentarian voting this legislation what kind of financial responsibility we put on the shoulder of the Canadian taxpayer when we vote that legislation?
Well, as I say, I'm prepared to indicate the amount that's already in the public domain with respect to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, because they are those that will prosecute these offences under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act.
And the federal prisons, for those who will be for 3 years, for instance, as that legislation provide, or 5 years like this legislation provide?
It's my understanding that you have invited colleagues from the Correctional Service of Canada who will give you that information to the extent that it's been noted in the estimates process.
Well, last time we asked for that question, we were told that it's cabinet document.
As I indicated, but CSC is better placed to indicate what information they can provide with respect to the cost for the Correctional Service of Canada.
And what is for the provinces?
Provinces?
Yeah.
I can't provide that information.
Were cost estimates taken into account when this bill was being drafted?
The costs for the federal government were definitely taken into account, as they are for all legislation.
It's just that we, the legislators, aren't allowed to know. I think that's what you're hearing, frustration about.
I appreciate that, but I believe that you will have the right people invited to your committee who can provide that information.
Well,
no, they will provide only, as you said, according to the limits that you yourself establish within a segment of information. That's why I think that we are asked here by the minister, who said he wanted us to support this legislation, but he asked for us to support that legislation with at least one hand on our eye, which is the cost for the Canadian taxpayers.
You can take the information that I can give you today with respect to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. You can add it to the information that the colleagues from Correctional Service of Canada may be able to provide to you. I cannot speak on their behalf. I'm a representative of the Department of Justice, and then that you would have a broader sense of both costs.
Yeah, but we won't have the cost for at least half of the persons who will find themselves under the scope of that legislation, those who will be sentenced to 1 year or 2 years sentence, because I think that what is unacceptable, as much as I am a legislator, is that here I have to sign this bill, but I won't know at the end how much more will be the burden for the Canadian taxpayer and how much will that be reflected on other priorities of the government. That's why I think that it's sensible for us to request from you the information that you have on your table when you draft the legislation. That's essentially what we are asking for. Not something that is outrageously a secret of state. This does not involve federal provincial secret. This does not involve foreign affairs, and it does not endanger the national security of Canada, the three counts for which normally the government refused to give the legislation.
Well, Senator, I appreciate your concern, but I've indicated the information that I'm prepared to provide to you, and that's all I can provide to you. The other information will have to come from other sources to the extent that it's not a cabinet confidence.
Ms. Kane? We do have to break, but I'm going to ask you said you could provide some information today,
Yes?
and I'm going to ask you when you return to your office to scrape the bottoms of the drawers to find as much information as you can legally provide to us. We understand that you operate under the constraints of any civil servant who is dealing with cabinet documents. You understand, I believe, probably better after the last 5 minutes than even you did before, this committee's natural desire to understand as much as it can about the impact of the legislation before it. Any information that can be provided is better than none. The more information can be provided, the better. So I will ask you to go back and see if there is any information that can be provided to us that you don't have with you today in your file that says, yes, I can give them this today. Very well?
You don't want the figure, do you want the figure now?
Yes, please.
Fine. Then I just want to make sure that I give the right amount. And this is information that's publicly available on the Treasury Board of Canada website with respect to funding that's provided for the National Anti-Drug Strategy for the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. For this bill, $33.5 million over 5 years has been set aside for the provision of prosecution-related advice and litigation support during police investigations and the prosecution of the drug charges under this Act, resulting from the mandatory minimum penalties. And this funding is being held in a frozen allotment that would be provided upon proclamation of this bill.
Gee, we really are out of time. But how do you allocate money once a law is passed? How do you single out which bit of a prosecution relates to that fund and which doesn't? Doesn't that become a rather costly business in its own right?
There's a Treasury Board process to allocate the money that will provide it in the course of the estimates when the legislation is proclaimed into force, and that money will be provided to the Public Prosecution of Service of Canada. That amount is the amount that has been estimated as being the incremental amount needed with respect to the prosecution of the either increased number of prosecutions or, as noted, longer trials, perhaps all of those factors that are taken into account. Obviously, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada has capacity now for the prosecution of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act across the country, and they do prosecute those offenses. This is the incremental amount that will be needed for this particular piece of legislation.
Okay, but they don't have to apply on a case-by-case basis or
No.
anything. Just goes into their general pot. Forgive me, Senator Joyal, I have really eroded your time.
I think the witness understood what we're trying to get as information. We're not trying to block the legislation. We're trying to understand the impact on the overall system. And I think it's a fair question to try to understand what kind of pressure that will put additional pressure on the prison system, which is overcrowded as much as we have heard from past, witnesses and past testimonies that we have heard here. So that's fair for us to ask you those questions and try to understand the impact that will cause in the prison system and in the prosecutorial system of Canada.
Put those questions to the Correctional Service, but people who were around this table a year ago will recall that when we did, we got very little information.
Zero information. And it took an investigation of the Parliamentary Budget Officer on the 241 bill to try to get some statistics, and there we are, still floating around with numbers because nobody seems to be able to pin down the additional cost. We were told at the original testimony that there would be no incremental cost, and we finally end up with billions of dollars. So, thank you.
That is for tomorrow morning's meeting, which will begin at 10:30. Will be held in this room, and we're going to hear.
I think in view of the witnesses and the evidence they give, and I understand fully where Senator Shoyal is coming from, and he makes the point that these are legitimate questions, and I don't think any of us would debate that. But there's a suggestion that we're educating the witnesses and telling them that whether you want to or not, you have to provide us with these figures. I didn't sense any reluctance on their part to provide the information they had. Quite the contrary. Ms. Kane told exactly what the incremental cost would be, which is the question that relates to the evidence she can give. What we're going to hear from public safety and other witnesses about other related costs, that's for another day. But I just want to make the point, I didn't sense any reluctance on the part of these witnesses to provide the information she had.
It only took 5 questions coming back before we got an answer. Maybe it took a while to understand the question.
Ms. Kane did say, roundabout question 2.5, that she could give us the numbers she could give us. What you do see, though, and I think we're all agreed with this, is that we all, not just for this bill, but in general, we do tend to be frustrated by the lack of factual information that underlies decisions. You can go back and say those senators are really building up a head of steam, or you can say whatever you want. But I would reiterate, Ms. Kane, if there's any further information about other implications of this bill, financial implications that you can, upon reflection, provide for us, they would also be appreciated. And as I was saying, tomorrow we shall hear from, beginning at 10:30, the Correctional Services of Canada, and after them, the officials responsible for managing the National Anti-Drug Strategy. We will hear from people representing Health Canada, Justice Canada, again, lucky you guys, and Public Safety Canada. We are grateful to you very much. This has been a little more rancorous than it sometimes is. It's not personal. It is institutional, but real. Thank you very much indeed. And colleagues, we stand adjourned until 10:30 tomorrow morning.